Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar for this afternoon, September 12th, 2018. The subject matter for the webinar is Building a Safety Culture, Part 2. We have 3 speakers today for the webinar, all involved in safety from one aspect or another. We have Denise Honsberger, who will be talking about hazards and hazard analysis. Denise works for the Rudolph Libbe Group, which is a full-service construction and specialty trades contractor employer. She works as a human resource administrator and workers' compensation administrator. She is a certified occupational safety specialist and has background in healthcare, manufacturing, and has also worked in law firms. She has an associate's degree from Owens College and a bachelor's degree from Heidelberg College. Donald Elswick will be speaking on some high-level analytics and leading indicators. He'll wrap up the webinar. He's a certified safety professional, a certified environmental safety and health trainer, and a certified hazardous materials manager. Among other things, he also happens to be a professor at the University of Findlay in the Environmental Health and Safety Department, and he operates a consulting firm called Elsmart and Associates. The man speaking to you at the moment is Carl Habekost. I'm an attorney and head of the Labor and Employment section at the law firm of Bugbee Conkle. I'm a certified occupational safety specialist, certified occupational safety manager, and have OSHA 30-hour designations in both general industry and construction. I'm certified by the Ohio State Bar Association and Ohio Workers' Compensation Law, and I'm a part-time adjunct professor in the Environmental Health and Safety Department at the University of Findlay. We thank you, all 3 of us, for taking the time to attend this webinar today. We're going to try to get it done in 60 minutes, but hey, maybe we won't. We're just going to keep going until we're done. Carrie Ramirez is operating the webinar, and Carrie, will the attendees have the opportunity to ask us questions?
Yeah, you can go ahead and type any questions in the chat section, and we will try to address them at the end of the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Without further ado, we're going to get started. We had a very successful webinar in July of 2017, so we thought we would go from there, and I'm going to do a brief review. We talked about building a safety culture and why should you care. One aspect of that was taking a look at the cost of an accident. As you might remember, a cost of an accident is sort of like the iceberg principle. The most obvious part of the costs are medical costs and time away from work, lost wages that the company might be paying, and that's merely only about 10%. The remaining 90% of the cost involved might be equipment, repair, finding somebody to take the injured worker's place, decreased morale, taking the time to investigate the accident. So all of that put together, an accident can be quite expensive. We thought that the best way to address that is a behavioral safety approach. Behavioral safety is where the employees and the entire organization takes ownership over the safety program, and we address the human aspect of safety. We also discussed continuous improvement in the safety program. We really drilled down into incident investigations and the process involved with that, and with the hope of getting to zero. As part of getting to zero, we talked about a safety continuum. Initially, companies, when they're in the avoidance stage, I guess would be the way to put it, believe safety is just a burden. They get a little further along and think, yeah, well, maybe safety is actually a necessity, but we really don't like it. And I've had clients over the years who advance to the compliance stage, where safety is a priority. Safety is a goal, but they kind of go through the motions saying merely that, we got to do this to comply with the rules, the regulations, and the law. When a company becomes enlightened, they realize that safety is actually a value. Safety is who we are as an organization. From the highest level to the lowest level, people are involved in safety. So that's the safety continuum. We talked about that last time. We discussed some strategies to get to zero. Leadership, probably the single most important aspect or the most important strategy is leadership. If the leaders of the organization are safety conscious and they value their employees, they will put time, energy, and money into safety. They will develop systems. Safety systems can be whatever you want it to be. It can be mechanical. It can be electronic. It can be behavioral. But whatever type of system you come up with has to be focused on with the vision of the organization to get to zero accidents. Speaking of vision, vision is very important for any safety program. And that comes from the leadership and the maintenance person equally. Everyone has to be engaged, so you have to have a strategy for engagement. How do you get people engaged? Do you listen to what the people who are doing the job have to say about that job? Do you listen to them when they say they're concerned that somebody's going to get injured? If you respond as a leader to those comments and those questions, you'll get engagement from the organization. Finally, a culture. A culture really is what people do around the coffee pot. What are they talking about? Are they belly aching and expressing negativity? That is your culture. If they're talking about outside activities, such as sports or music or what they did over the weekend, that represents your culture. If people are talking about safety and they're engaged in safety and they're recommending safety procedures to each other, that is your culture, and that's what you want to strive for. Then we reviewed, if you might remember, data. And Don Elswick's going to talk about that later today. What do you do with data? Are you looking at leading indicators or lagging indicators? By the way, does management even care? Are they looking at the data? Are they tracking indicators, lagging and leading? Is data actually used to improve safety behaviors, and are you communicating the results of the data analysis to everyone involved? Denise Honsberger is going to talk a little bit about communication after someone has expressed maybe a near miss or what I'll call a near hit. What does the company do to report back to the employees and everyone who's involved? How do you measure the success of your safety program? Is it merely a lack of injuries? Is that how you measure your safety program? So you have 0 lost time injuries. You have 0 reported injuries. Does that mean you have a safe workplace? Or is it exposure? Exposure to hazards. Are you as an organization looking at the exposure to hazards of your workers, your employees, and your associates? I think how you answer that question determines your safety culture. Are you as an organization proactive or are you reactive? What we mean by that is somebody's driving a forklift and they have the forks up rather than down. People are walking around the warehouse. You as a worker go, oh boy, that's an accident waiting to happen, because you don't do anything. You wait until somebody gets hurt. Somebody ought to do something, and what we are telling you here today and hoping that you agree is that someone is you. You have to take ownership over your safety program. And as I say in almost every little presentation, if you don't take ownership over your safety program, OSHA is going to take ownership over it for you. So take control of your program, build a safety culture that's worthy of your time and efforts. And finally, I think we just kind of touched on what are accidents. Is an accident an unexpected and undesirable event that results in damage or harm? Is it a circumstance that is not essential to the nature of that activity? That are some Webster definitions of accidents. It's something bad that happens. Are accidents beyond an individual's control? Are accidents always preceded by unsafe acts or hazardous conditions, or is it a combination of both? If I remember right, Denise, you can correct me, but I think we decided after our webinar last year that accidents are almost always preceded by unsafe acts or hazardous conditions. We did, yeah. And that means that you can control unsafe acts and hazardous conditions, and you can get to zero. What we didn't talk a whole lot about last time, and we're going to focus on today, are hazards, risk of hazards, and near misses or near hits. It really doesn't make sense to call them near misses because, you know, you're actually missing a hit on an accident. So what are hazards? I gave you some examples. Water on the floor, but nobody slips on it. Some broken equipment, but nobody's been injured. Very hot weather, but no one passes out or suffers from heat exhaustion. So that they are an existing or potential condition that by themselves or in combination with each other can but do not cause a harm. That's one definition of a hazard. And as I get into some case law, you'll see that a definition of a hazard is very important. You will also see, as we move through the webinar today, that analyzing and tracking near misses is very important. Near misses expose weaknesses in safety procedures. They help to identify historical trends, and they are another way to discover workplace hazards. But they're not the only way. What are some other ways you can discover workplace hazards? Audits? Anything further, Denise?
Well, even discussing and having open communication with your employees if they see safety concerns or want to bring it to your attention.
Would that be like safety meetings?
You could do that, or having some sort of system where they can report whether it's directly or indirectly any hazards they might see in the job site or in their work areas that they think leadership needs to
Right, like
address.
maybe a hotline, so to speak, a safety concern hotline.
Or a lot of companies will have find it fixes or safety cards that you can fill out and turn into
Right.
and they can review them on a regular basis.
Right, drop them in a box.
Right.
So we've got safety meetings, communication, self-audits, walk-arounds.
Pre-task and post-task planning.
Yes.
Options for that.
Job hazard analysis. We recommend you create a near-miss program. So we're going to go back to definitions. Words matter. Clearly define a near-miss. What do you mean by a near-miss? I believe that Denise talks about that in her presentation. You have to create a reporting format. We just discussed that. Some way for people to report safety concerns. Distribute information to those involved in the near miss. And I know that Denise Honsberger has a slide on that. You have to tell people what you found out when you investigated the near miss. You identify some solutions and then let people know. And I'll tell you why that's important from a behavioral standpoint. Because people who are working, working people, if they know that safety personnel, their supervisors, or their management are actually listening to them and investigating their concerns and then reporting back to them, they are going to be engaged. And when everyone is engaged in safety, it all works and you can get to zero.
Well, and you're absolutely right. If a company, does recognize these things and fixes a hazard or a dangerous situation, that's great. But if they don't, go back to their employees and say, this is what you said to us, we heard you, and this is now what we did, they're not going to recognize that action.
Correct. Well, I did mention OSHA, and I'm sure everyone on this webinar knows what OSHA is. But because this is going to be out on the internet, I'm going to say that OSHA stands for two different things. Occupational Safety Health Act, which is the law that enabled the administrative agency, also with the acronym OSHA, called Occupational Safety Health Administration, to become involved in workplace safety. Most of you know OSHA when they come and knocking at your door, and they do an investigation. They issue a citation. I'm going to let you know what OSHA has to prove when they issue a citation. They have to prove that the cited standard applies, that the employer failed to comply with the terms of the cited standard, employees had access to the violative condition, and the employer either knew or could have known, and that is in bold because that's what is going to be involved with our webinar today, with the exercise of reasonable diligence of this condition. Why is that important? I'm going to give you a case here real quick. We just talked about establishing a near-miss program. And I have clients who are concerned that they're creating a paper trail for a lawsuit down the road. Well, my response is, your main concern should be the safety of your people. And OSHA encourages near-miss programs. In fact, if you go to their website, they have guidelines on establishing a near-miss program. But are those records available for review by OSHA? There's an interesting case. It's on your screen. It involves demolition of a building down in Dallas, the Cleveland Wrecking Company. I'm not sure if it's corporate out of Cleveland, Ohio. And there are other cities in the United States called Cleveland, but I guarantee you none of them have a football team like the Browns, and none of them had a Cuyahoga River that caught on fire. So I just wanted to say that the Cleveland Wrecking Company was in charge. They were sort of the general contractor for the demolition of 3 buildings in Dallas. The bottom line, or the essential facts of this case, are that the Cleveland Wrecking Company could not get the crane that was necessary to do the job. So they sort of did the best they could. They established a chute, and as they demolished the building story by story, they dumped steel and cement and other debris down a chute, down to the dump area. To secure the safety of the people in the drop zone was not followed. Dump truck driver and another employee, the flagger, down in the drop zone were killed when a guy running a bobcat on the 21st floor accidentally hit a steel beam, drove the steel beam into a cement wall, and the cement wall and the steel beam went crashing down on these 2 people in the drop zone. The primary argument of the employer was, we had developed our safety procedure and we followed it the best we could, and we had no idea that something like this was going to happen. So therefore, we did not know or could have known of this type of problem. And what OSHA then said, oh, really? Okay. Well, we know from talking to your people that you've had several instances of steel dropping down and hitting a windshield or causing close injuries, and we know they've been reported, so we want to see your near-miss documentation. And in that instance, the review commission said, yes, you got to turn over the near-miss documentation. As a general rule, OSHA is not going to hammer you over the head with near-miss documentation because they want to encourage employers to actually have a near-miss program. And if you need more information on that, contact us. Some interesting information has come out in the news the last couple of years on workplace violence, and that all flows under the General Duty Clause. The important part of the General Duty Clause, once again, is the fact that the employer has to provide a work environment that is free from recognized hazards. And that's the focus of our webinar, recognized hazards.
Carl, do you think that there is a detriment or any reason you would not want to have a good near-miss program and document or include that type of data in your analytics?
No. I strongly recommend it. You're better off to try to prevent injuries than you are to try to hide from a potential lawsuit. General Duty Clause, the emphasis is on recognized hazards. The General Duty Clause is used when there is no specific regulation available. And, for example, workplace violence and heat exposure. The next slide, we list the elements of a General Duty Clause violation. And I'm going to emphasize the fact that we're talking about hazards. All four elements have the word hazard in it. So you really should be doing hazard analysis at your workplace. This is an interesting case. It still has yet to be decided. In other words, it's pending. It's Secretary of Labor versus Sturgill Roofing. This involves a temporary employee, 61 years old, first day on the job, and the heat index was right at 100 degrees. He was working on the job. The company did advise him, and this was acknowledged by everyone, including OSHA, that he was told if you don't feel good or if you need to take a break, go to the shade. We got water over here. But that was it. The foreman didn't monitor him, and halfway through the day, the guy was stumbling around on the roof. They got him down off the roof. He died 21 days later of complications of heat stroke. OSHA issued a serious violation under the General Duty Clause. The company appealed the case. They've argued it, and we were actually listening to part of the oral argument before the Review Commission today, before the webinar. The Review Commission actually seems to be questioning whether or not the General Duty Clause is appropriate to evaluate working in hot weather. So stay tuned, the results of that case. But once again, hazard analysis is important. The final case, before we turn it over to Denise Honsberger, is a tragedy, and I wish I had more time to talk about this. It involves a health care organization called Integra. They handled what we call a population that gets lost. They kind of slip through the cracks. They don't have phones. They don't have money to go to their doctor's appointments. They don't take their medication as prescribed, and they end up going to the hospital and costing a lot of money. There is data out there that establishes that 80% of someone's health is determined by socioeconomic factors, only 20% by clinical factors. So Integra and other companies like them help insurance companies. Insurance companies identify these at-risk people. Integra would send what they call service coordinators to the houses. Sometimes these people lived in tents. Sometimes they would meet them at little restaurants. But the point of it is, these service providers or service coordinators met at-risk people who had severe mental disorders alone. Integra knew that that was a hazard. They knew because they had it in their handbook. If you feel uncomfortable because you're dealing with people with severe emotional problems, then just leave. That was their safety training program. The problem with that is it's a very subjective thing. What does it mean to be uncomfortable? And the bottom line is a 24-year-old woman who had just gotten her bachelor's degree, first real job, was stabbed 9 times by a psychologically unstable client, and she was inside the house, managed to get out on the front lawn, but she died. OSHA nailed the company with a serious violation under the general duty clause, saying that there was a hazard of employment, and the hazard was face-to-face meetings with dangerous individuals, and the company didn't even do a background check on these clients. So the emphasis on all of that is hazard identification. And that's it for my part of the program. Denise, you want to move on?
Sure. Thank you. So now that we know why safety is important, we're going to talk about hazard identification and abatement. It's really important for any operation to recognize, identify, and abate your hazards and risks. We're going to discuss some of the methods to identify those hazards, look at some examples, and then we're going to look at some hazard control measures. So Carl touched on the definition of a hazard. Health hazards cause illnesses. You might have a toxic chemical that's used for cleaning, for example. Safety hazards can cause physical injuries, you know, if you're missing a guard on some equipment. But you also need to consider risk. If you act when you see those risky behaviors and near miss or near hits, you're going to reduce the likelihood of more serious injuries and events down the road. But where do you start? That's the question we're talking about today. You need to start by assessing your current safety program and ask questions. Some questions might be, how does your organization currently identify hazards? How do they record injuries or achieve compliance? When you answer these questions, you're going to help develop a really robust improvement plan to identify and mitigate your hazards and risks. Then you want to develop a strategy to implement your improvement program. Outline those steps that you need to improve your processes and your health and safety program. The goal is obviously to have 0 injuries, illnesses, and near misses. So a basic approach to hazard identification can start with collecting information about your workplace hazards. Be sure you're familiar with the typical hazards associated with your industry. It's important to systematically look for and document your hazards. And don't forget to be aware of possible interactions. So an example might be you're doing some work in an aisleway in your workspace. So you close off the area so people aren't going to be near that event. The problem is your alternate route to go around that happens to walk right underneath some crane activity. You know, people were focused on that instant potential, but they didn't look around to see what other potentials happen as a result. There's a multitude of sources in the workplace that's available to you when you're identifying those hazards. You've got internal sources, so things inside your organization that are going to provide insight. We talked about earlier, observation, you know, watching your people and your processes, or discussing concerns with focus groups. Even something like looking at your equipment logs and safety audit results are really good things to do. The idea is to really look at your operation and find those opportunities to improve. In addition to those internal sources, you've got external sources or other outside ways to provide insight into your safety. And often, I think this information can be equally or more important to consider. Safety data sheets, for example, give you insight into problems related to chemicals. Your manuals will include common hazards for equipment, machinery, or vehicles. And government or regulatory agencies can provide guidance, and they may even be able to consult with your company and help you identify injuries. The key is to analyze your data and your trends. Don's going to discuss this topic in a little more detail shortly, but I guess I'm wondering, Carl and Don, what outside sources do you think are most helpful?
This is Carl. I think that industry associations and their publications are helpful, as well as OSHA information. I don't know if Don, are you there?
So,
here you go, Carl. What I was going to say, a lot of the data analytics will cover in mine, but bottom line is you need to benchmark against similar industries. So that's a great way to go through those.
Great.
Thanks.
Well, and as you systematically look at your workplace, be sure to look at small projects as well as your industry in general, like Don just mentioned. Seeing the big picture is going to help you identify trends and opportunities to reduce those common injuries, as well as looking at the near misses. There's a lot of tools out there that are available to help you document the hazards and risks that you find, and tracking data over a longer period of time is really going to help you yield the best results. Don't forget to utilize those experts or those external sources we just talked about when performing your tasks. Prioritize the jobs that you're analyzing. While it's really important to assess high injury rate jobs, that makes total sense, you don't want to forget about those near misses like we've talked about. And once you identify those uncontrolled hazards, start to take the steps needed to eliminate or reduce them. So we mentioned earlier, a great tool to assess risk is the job hazard analysis. This is going to focus on the relationship between the worker, the task, the tools, and then their environment. It kind of looks at the entire big picture. And I think it's a really great way to also show your commitment to safety. I don't know about you, Carl, but how effective do you think these are, or Don, and what types of businesses, are they really enlightening? Job hazard analysis.
Yeah, I was waiting for Don to answer.
Yeah, let me hit with this, Denise, and we'll talk about this. It's a great way to collect data. It's usually where you're trying to get the engagement that Carl talked about with your job hazard analysis and job safety analysis. This shouldn't be the outside expert coming in. This should be your person closest to the hazard. So it's a great way to really respect the employees, get engagement, and eliminate hazards.
Sure, even along the lines of even probably people wouldn't be thinking about, like the healthcare industry and ergonomic issues, as well as machine
manufacturing plants.
Yeah, manufacturing.
All right, well, we talked about hazard analysis as a great form or tool, and it helps you look at your work or your industry. But regardless of the tools that you use, it's really important to keep track of what you look like and identify those next steps. Review your findings regularly and then make changes. If you don't review and make changes, you're not going to progress to zero. Pre-task planning, I think that's a great way to start any project or any workday. You're really getting those hazards in front of your workers, and it allows for communication to address concerns. If an element of your job changes, reassess your plan. Once you've identified your hazards, determine how to control them. You want to consider the nature of your hazard and the route of entry. So how severe is your hazard? Is it likely to happen more than once? What's that source? Is it a traditional or a non-traditional workplace? Develop clear plans and procedures to identify those risks and hazards. Don't forget, you might need to put interim measures in place while you develop and execute your plan of action. And make sure you ask a lot of questions. Who's going to be involved in developing the plan? What are the actual root causes? Remember, not to play the blame game, but Really dig deep for that. And then again, how do you communicate that plan? Once you've identified the hazards, mitigate and control them. You know, a basic control method is elimination. You're removing the hazard at the source. You might substitute when you find some other material or process that can control the hazard. For example, swapping out a less toxic product for a highly toxic one. And then we've talked about engineering controls where you isolate and reduce the hazard with those measures, like putting up a safety barrier around an area where work is dangerous. So those are all important.
I mean, not letting you walk underneath the crane?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, you need to look at that big picture. But if you can develop engineering controls and start at the design phase, that's a great opportunity for you because those control measures can be integrated more easily and, you know, usually at a lower cost at that stage. Hazardous materials can be removed before the equipment's opened, or a system can be designed to be maintenance-free. So that's a great way to start there. If your work has already started, you can monitor and sample, have monitoring and sampling programs, you know, but what do they look like? If they're not effective, what good is that for you? Are you measuring noise levels or sampling air quality? You know, what process can you redesign to reduce your risk? If you can remove hazardous materials before the equipment is opened, then you're thinking ahead before the near miss even occurs. If certain chemicals are involved, don't forget you might need a process hazard analysis. You know, you want to refer to OSHA for any of those analyses that might be required depending on your scope of work. You know, just document to OSHA that you've considered this and you've looked at that. And don't forget to think about the ongoing maintenance. You know, you've got leak and exposure potentials that might need to be addressed, not only what you're expecting, but what things might happen that you're not expecting, those emergency situations. Administrative controls, when they're put in place, that helps mitigate hazards. You can look at training and supervision. That's very important, but you may also be able to change your work practices or your worker schedules. Remove an employee from harm, and that might be an interim solution while your long-term plan is developed. And PPE, that's really your last, line of defense there. You want to continually reassess PPE and make sure that is it being used, and if it is being used, is it effective? It might be well and good to have people in safety glasses, but if they're welding, goggles may be the better option. Once you've identified the hazards and developed your plans to control them, you want to implement the changes, the plans, and the processes. Make sure you're monitoring your implementation process. I'm having a hard time saying that today. On an ongoing basis, and make sure your control measures are effective. Have you really minimized the risks like you thought you would? And like we talked about in our earlier example, have you created additional hazards by putting one in place? So don't be afraid to test those control measures before your work actually begins. You might identify unexpected results and then need to modify your plan. A critical piece of your implementation process is going to be to determine how you're going to communicate the results and the changes to your workplace. You want to make sure that your workers are aware of the changes and they actually understand them.
Yes, that is critical, and that's what we talked about, to communicate to the employees what they said and what the company did.
And I think this little image we have is a great way to show your employees, this is what you said, this is what we heard, and this is what we've done. You're putting that action in front of your employees so they know you're paying attention.
Yes.
And last, I think it's important to document your changes. You want to get feedback and measure results. Review those hazards and your risk assessments, your hazard analyses, and revise them, rewrite them, or replan whenever it's necessary. You know, the idea is obviously to get to zero.
Correct. I think Don Elswick's going to be taking off now, getting some involvement with our attendees and talk about data analysis. Don?
Thanks, Carl. So we've pulled all the information earlier together. We have an engaged workforce, so giving us data. So what do we do with that? Well, a lot of times when we're analyzing data, we want to look at it from two directions. First, are we a pessimist or an optimist? Well, again, the pessimist sees, as Winston Churchill says, the difficulty in every opportunity, but the optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty. I hope that's how we're thinking. And again, the pessimist sees the failure in every accident. The optimist sees the opportunity to analyze, learn, and prevent. So again, that's what we hope we're doing with our data. One of the things that, as we're launching forward, just tell me, what group do you believe has the highest number of accidents? So we've got answers A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, different age groups in there. So here we're going to advance beyond number 1 to number 2 now. So out of this same grouping, what group has the highest numbers of drivers in fatal accidents?
We've got 1A, 3 C's, and 6 G's so far. A lot of.
All right, awesome. That's great then. So, you know, the earlier question number 1, we had a lot of people that thought the younger drivers. It looks like the older drivers, you're looking at that, or as I say, my age group, the G age group, not quite yet, but we're getting there. Mature drivers were more experienced, and maybe we just lose that fear. So go ahead and let's go to question number 3 now. So here's kind of your trivia based on the 2009 Safety Council statistics, a little bit older. Who would you want to be your driver here? Again, same area, go ahead out there, pick out of these. Who would you, if you had to recruit a chauffeur, who would you want to drive you?
Almost everybody is putting E right now.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Well, what are we doing with this? So, Carrie, go ahead and advance me forward there. I don't have control, so that's awesome. So I want you guys to notice, based on the data, not what we thought, again, here are the actual numbers for the group with the highest number of accidents for number 1. Some of you should be surprised it's group E. I want to go ahead to question number 2, and you'll see that the highest number of drivers in fatal accidents, again, is the 25 to 34. And if you were strictly going on the statistics, you would want a 16-year-old because they have the lowest number of accidents and the lowest fatality. Well, we all know, wait a minute, that's data we've collected, but what's the problem there? Well, we all were probably young once, and maybe our parents, when we got into an accident, didn't want to raise the insurance, so they didn't report it. Well, what I'd like to do next is say, so what's my point? A lot of times, what you believe to be true may not be. So I want to challenge your perceptions on not only the data you're collecting, but looking at that data and analyzing that data. So one of the things that we've got to be careful about, and you'll notice I just did it on that data, I gave you just some data that was very short term. It was 1 year. It actually involved 2009 stats, and it didn't repeat. Well, if you notice in my chart here, we talked about data that's somehow grouped together, which is what we had. You know, maybe even subjects in that group, but we want to correlate it. We want to measure it. We want to make sure it's repeated data. And really the last one's most important. We want longitudinal data that does it over numerous years. So often we want to look at a short term, and our managers want to look at a year or two snapshot. Well, when we're doing data, we need more data than just 1 year. with that said, I've got again, and I'm not going to turn this over to what I'll call Chad, but I'm just curious, how many of you believe these are true or false? So we'll discuss them. I'm seeing it's usually what happens on these. Low recordable rates indicate your safety program's working. Well, we know that a lot of managers look at it and say, hey, that is absolutely correct. Well, we know usually low recordable rates is not a measure of engagement. It's not a measure of corrective actions. Probably a lot of reasons that's not true. All injuries can be attributed to unsafe behaviors. We know that a lot of people love to believe that, but let's face it, the organization itself, what they have, as Carl mentioned, the culture, if it's a get-it-done culture, can create problems, and even more than that, you can have defective equipment. The number 3 there, enforcing rules increases safety. Well, we have a lot of people that think, hey, we'll discipline our way to safety. We've seen, most of us have lived through those programs that it does not work. And then the last 2 are interesting. Can we reward improved safety? And we just got to investigate everything. Well, that is your safety person's nightmare, because as long as you're rewarding, you're not getting any data. And when you're investigating everything, you waste time with incidents that maybe are not of a serious nature. So I put on the right side here, and I hope somebody noticed, this data came out in 1997, and this was an evidence-based article. All of these were false in 97, and I think we're now close to 30 years or 31 years ahead, and we hope that most of these are false. If you have, or we know these are false, hopefully in your organization you've recognized that. So with the data, and I'm going to go forward here, one of the things that I love to look at is safety performance, especially in the U.S. We've had if you look at the top line, the total recordable injury rate, again, that's measured with the 2,000 hour, has declined, and guess what? The fatality rate, if you notice, has not declined at the same rate. So again, what's that mean to us? We need to really concentrate, as we said earlier, on data that effectively presents or prevents what we know are the fatalities. So with that said, I want to present to you kind of the traditional, and we're all familiar with this, traditional accident pyramid. In particular with this, I want us to start looking at traditional safety triangles, not really predictive. We need to look at some of the serious injury fatality potential. So again, if you notice, the traditional triangle would tell you to only concentrate on certain areas. We need to really look at the data over a long range. We need to look outside of the normal triangle, and we need to look at contributing factors. And that's, again, where your data will go. So I've got 4 headlines we're going to go through, and I hope you'll agree with these. Maybe we'll get some chatter on this. But the OSHA recordable log is misleading when it comes to serious injury fatality. My other earlier data indicated that, and I want you to also look at a couple of examples we're going to go through here. So the first one, I have an employee entered a palletizer to remove a bag. The machine cycled, struck him on the shoulder, causing a significant bruise. This was the first aid case. Well, if you look at this incident, if you do the traditional approach, this is going to be not even a recordable. You know, basically it's a bruise. We'll never know about it. Well, once again, we know that this incident does have a high risk and a serious potential for accident. The next one I want you to look at is an employee was cleaning a scroll conveyor, didn't see the need to follow lockout tagout, because production wasn't running. He didn't think anyone would turn on the equipment while he was cleaning it. And while he had his hand in the equipment, someone actually turned something on and activated the scroll. This seriously injured the employee's hand. Well, it's easy to say, hey, this is a lost time injury, but once again, and maybe the employee gained full use of his hands after this, which is what happened, but we still got to look at the potential. What if that had pulled him into the machine? So we may be disguising some of the data. And the last one that I want to look at the example here, an employee wasn't operating, an elevator wasn't operating properly. The employee replied on the knowledge of the defect, past experience to work around the problem. Some of the employees used a fabricated tool to open the elevator doors. An employee used the tool, opened the door, didn't recognize the elevator was a floor below, and fell 25 feet down the elevator shaft. Again, it's a serious injury, but this one has a lot of causes that maybe if we had been looking at some of the minor hits, again, just showing that on those three incidents, that OSHA log, if we really only use the last one where we would respond, we've missed two significant incidents. So that's what we're saying. The SIF blind spot is significant. So I want you to, again, think through some of the exposure determinations, and in particular, looking at what happens with property damage versus what recordable non-restricted. So if you look at the one here, you saw a vented carbon filter coming out. The local fire department's on scene. We vented the gas and continue to put water on the fire. Well, we may class that as a property damage, but we could be missing, again, some of the recordable non-restricted. While digging in the mud of a press, an operator felt a strain on his back, hit his neck on his left arm, and the employee received physical therapy. So again, that property damage may be as serious as the restricted non-recordable. And I've got two more examples I want to go through. A near miss with a lost time. Again, a crane operator operating a bucket, basically it drops 19 feet, struck a vent, and again, no one was injured. So maybe we don't see the serious injury fatality in that data, so we need to somehow capture that. And if you notice an employee was closing an electrical breaker on the centrifuge when he experienced groin pain, again, it may be a double hernia, require surgery. It's a lost time incident, but which exposure maybe could have the more serious? Again, you need to look at both and look at that data. So I've got one more example I just wanted you to look at, utilizing a platform. Again, he's trying to climb back onto the platform. It collapses. Two co-workers hold on to the handrail, allowing the employee to climb safely back to the platform. Again, a near miss while bagging. And if you look at the other one, two operators, 1 ton onto a cart. The lifting chain broke. At this point, it falls to the ground, and no one was injured. So again, two definite exposure determination. If we're only looking at the recordable log, we may miss something. With that said, I want to go to accident investigations, which again is how data should be collected. And I always say, well, let's just investigate everything. Well, we know that's not the right response, nor is it even practical. So we have to really narrow down what we're going to investigate and have a proportional response. So again, you can set up any way you want to, but you need to have a proportional response to any incident. Maybe you set up certain programs if you're interested in lockout tagout, powered industrial truck, hydrogen sulfide. Maybe those are programs that get a deeper investigation, and then some of the other exposures maybe don't get that deep investigation. Again, it's all about pulling in the data. With that said, the last point I want to make, and I'm going to try to go back on that, is SIF events are not one-off. The precursors have been there all the time. We should realize on the incidents I showed you earlier, there are probably some precursors to this event. It may be where managers have told employees, hey, I don't want you to wait on this anymore. We know how to get this done. So this medical first aid may cause some of those precursors. Again, the same with the lost time and the same with the serious injuries. So as you're looking at your data collection, make sure you educate your senior leaders on serious injury, fatality potential. You provide visibility to your organization. The other thing, too, is you know your SIF precursors and you integrate into existing safety management systems. So the last poll question I've got, and we'll end, I know we're almost out of time, is I'd like for you to go and tell me which of these are your top exposure. So we got some forklift, we've got some elevated work, especially with the new regulations. All right, great. And the other, obviously not ready to go, but that's what you see. And here's my last call. Once you identify this serious injury fatality, again, Denise talked about this, look at your hierarchy of controls. Go through and try to eliminate your hazards. That's where your data will really show the least dependent on employee behavior. And again, as you go lower in that hierarchy, you'll get the most dependent. So data analysis is significant and underutilized. Again, I've got 4 pieces of advice. Incorporate those serious injury fatality precursors into your data. Ask employees to review them. Use strategic goals if you have something you're trying to prevent. And again, use that longitudinal data. So that's what I wanted you to kind of have a new way of thinking with your SIF exposures. I know many organizations have implemented this and seen the benefit not only in the lagging, but the leading indicators. And I want to leave your last thought was from Eleanor Roosevelt, the things you refuse to me today always come back at you later, usually under circumstances which make the decision twice as difficult as it originally was. And again, with our seminar today, we hope we've given you some ways to not only look at data, collect data, but also analyze. So I'll turn it back over to you, Carl.
Yeah, well, thanks, Don. Do we have any questions?
Yes, we had one question. It says, I am a behavioral-based safety advocate. But lately I noticed that people tend to shy away from behavioral-based safety conversation in safety programs, and have you seen the same?
Let me take that one, Carrie. So what you're seeing is a general trend because of some really poor implementation of BBS, where people have tried to implement parts of behavior-based system. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in that, Scott Geller, obviously kind of the father of BBS, has some books out on actively caring. And if you're interested, send to the, to Carrie or myself an email. We'll recommend some books. And again, you can go in and look at BBS has its place. Probably a few of you have heard about human organizational performance. Todd Copeland has talked a lot about that. It's kind of, they said, hey, this is the death of BBS. When you go in and look at them both, you need to definitely both has or have positives, you need to understand your culture. So I'll tell you right now, whoever wrote the question, don't give up on BBS. Look at how you can refine and use that. And if you run into the negativity, look at how it was implemented and used. Because like most tools, you can get great data out of that. I hope that answered it.
Well, I was just going to tag on, Don, that we have heard people complaining about behavioral-based safety, but I think a lot of it has to do with your culture, too, what kind of culture you have. Behavioral-based safety has been shown to be quite successful. From my standpoint, defending employers in safety litigation matters, it's easy to point to employee engagement, and behavioral-based safety seems to get employees involved. And if the employees are involved and you focus on humans and how they behave, and you buy into the aspect or the concept that accidents can be avoided and you can get to zero, then behavioral-based safety makes sense. If your culture is one to where you're critical, I guess would be the way to put it, and it's sort of top-down management, then behavioral-based safety doesn't work. Do you have any comment?
Right. I think you can't just look, well, and we've talked about this, you need to really look at all the at-risk behaviors, all of the potential, and all of those things. If you're only reporting or looking at lost time claims, then you're
recordable accidents. Yeah.
You have to prioritize and actively
be proactive.
Be proactive with behavioral.
Yeah. Any other questions, Carrie? Well, somehow we did that in 60 minutes. I actually thought we were going to go about 75 minutes when we started this. If we don't have any other questions, do you have any other comments you'd like to make, Denise? Professor Elswick, Commander Elswick, anything else you want to tag on?
No, just thanks for everyone that joined us. Any questions, feel free to send to us, and thanks again.
Great. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.